Good morning, Wabash. Today's chapel speaker, Professor Brouwer, graduated from Grinnell in 1991 with a degree in philosophy. Afterwards, he went to the New College of California in San Francisco, where he earned a master's in poetics in '97. While there, he sold gourmet wines and spirits for 5 years and became a self-proclaimed malt whiskey enthusiast. As a result of this self-proclaimed title, he was featured in the Wine Spectator in 1993 in an article on single malt Scotch whiskey. Later, he received another master's and his PhD from Duquesne University in the area of philosophy. His first teaching job was here at Wabash, which he started in 2003. He's since been recognized as a Lilly Teaching Fellow. He's happily married to a French wife who today, while he will be giving his chapel talk, will be taking the test to become an American citizen. So we wish her good luck. Professor Brouwer is particularly proud of surviving 3 months as an iron barber in a foundry in rural France. And on campus, he says he has a feeling that students poke fun of the way he paces and strokes his beard, along with the fact that he loves the phrase, "and that is the crucial move." During homecoming, Professor Brouwer was one of our faculty judges, and of course he says that is one of the greatest honors that has been bestowed upon him. So please join me in welcoming Professor Brouwer for his chapel talk, Why It's Hard to Have a Conversation.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Sphinx Club for the honor of speaking here today. It is a genuine honor, and thank you all of you for coming. To freshmen and those of you who missed my chapel talk last February, at that time I tried to sketch what I take to be the nature of Wabash College, its genus and species. The idea was that small private liberal arts college is our genus, and for men is our species. The point is that what makes Wabash exceptional is certainly not our curriculum, nor is it our small class size or excellent faculty or chapel sing or even the Monon Bell game. All small private liberal arts colleges have things like these or something comparable. No, what makes Wabash College exceptional is that it is a college for men. Teaching men enables me to teach and you to learn the liberal arts particularly well. While my talk today does not address men's education directly, I believe these remarks ought to be particularly relevant here, and I understand them as my ongoing effort to learn about this remarkable institution. The alternate title of my talk today is Civil Discourse and Verbal Combat. Today I would like to defend a peculiar sort of verbal combat, as opposed to what I'll call mere civil discourse or mere intellectual sparring. Please make no mistake that I find some kinds of verbal combat tedious, useless, and degrading to all participants. The very peculiar sort of verbal combat I wish to defend, however, I find valuable and edifying. While some would prefer that I call this valuable and edifying sort of interaction conversation, and I will call it this, I believe the words verbal combat perfectly capture the competition and endurance that I love about good, vigorous conversation. One of my closest friends from graduate school is named Matt. He's a friend from whom I began learning the art of philosophical argument. Matt showed me the ropes of satisfying, challenging conversations. Matt and I argue. We have been doing so now for many years. But since we are philosophers and friends, we argue from a common ground, a ground of trust, charity, and most importantly, a mutual desire to learn from one another. Over the years, the subjects of our arguments have changed, from Husserl's concept of pure consciousness to Foucault's notion of resistance to our current president's foreign policy. We have never agreed on anything. Except one thing: the argument is always worth having. I don't know whether our arguments would withstand the often stringent test of civil discourse. We are animated, passionate, and quite frankly, we are men. Although we probably don't agree that our being men is the cause of it, we certainly agree that our arguments are agonistic. Agon is the ancient Greek word for competition, or the activity of contending for a prize. Agon is the root of our word agony, as in the agony of defeat. While our discussions have never come to blows, they are usually competitive, heated, and often exasperating. We always come back for more. Why? What common ground nourishes our desire to learn, calms our fears of falling, and provides the leverage to help each other up after every battle? What is our common ground of verbal combat? Before I even try to articulate the common ground from which our particularly agonistic conversations begin, let me be perfectly clear that it is not at all my intention to glorify violence of any sort, be it physical, emotional, or intellectual. On the contrary, I see argument as the best means of avoiding violence. However, you would be right to ask, how could a competitive verbal combat not be violent? I must concede right up front that an answer to this question depends upon a definition of violence that I do not have. However, I believe that violence, like virtue, and like two-ness, and like bigness, is something. I'm just not sure what. Consequently, it is not my place to stipulate a working definition of violence. Rather, I merely assume that we all have, more or less, some vague understanding of what violence is. In addition, and most controversially, I believe that violence necessarily involves harm and that no one desires to be harmed. Given this, I must maintain against all appearances to the contrary that, for example, heavyweight boxing is not violent, at least not with respect to the actual participants. Yet, is it not fairly obvious that boxers are harmed in the course of the event? My answer is no. I resist this obvious appearance by saying that real harm is necessarily involuntary. When a boxer has his nose broken, this is not a case of harm, precisely because the boxer was willing to have his nose broken. If the boxer wasn't willing to have his nose broken, then he certainly was harmed, but he wasn't really a boxer. He may be the victim of an assault, perhaps one for which he unwillingly volunteered. Clearly, in such a case, he can and should quit boxing. I do not believe that it is even possible for someone to suffer violence because they want to. If someone is willing to suffer pain and does so, then this pain is not violence. Please note the real and ugly possibility that someone might be willing to suffer a certain degree of pain, but the actual degree of pain suffered surpasses what they were willing to endure. Instances like this are often genuinely tragic, and I in no way mean to make light of them. It is tragic when a player suffers a life-changing injury because, as with all tragedy, it is never clear just where the fault lies. The injured player didn't agree to this extent of pain and suffering, and in that respect the player has become the victim of violence. Yet, unfortunately in such cases, it is usually violence without a clear perpetrator. Such violence is truly tragic. Only now can I begin to make sense of my claim that vigorous discussion and verbal combat are the primary means to avoid violence, be it physical, emotional, or intellectual. They are means of avoiding violence just insofar as all participants are willing participants. However, while all forms of verbal combat may be ways of avoiding violence, not all forms of verbal combat are worth the fight. For centuries, we have, if tacitly and occasionally insincerely, agreed not to harm those with whom we disagree, but rather to engage them in civil discourse, in public, in parliament, and in print. The social contract theory can be helpfully understood as a form of government wherein citizens agree to resolve their disagreements with discourse as opposed to violence. On this account, at least according to Thomas Hobbes, what ultimately keeps us coming back to the fight is nothing but our fear of violence. With all due respect to civil discourse, I find this a fairly impoverished account of real conversation. It fails to capture the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, and the love of learning that motivate my arguments with my good friend Matt. Matt is a boxer, yet Matt and I, thank goodness, do not box. Boxing is like civil discourse. Neither is violent insofar as the participants participate willingly. In both cases, victory is the proximate goal of each, and the game itself is the ultimate goal of both. Boxing and civil discourse are different means of avoiding violence. But the fear of violence could not motivate Matt and me to argue with the passion and commitment that grounds our discussions. We all know those who spar, physically, emotionally, and intellectually, for no other reason than to win, or for the love of sparring. If these were the reasons for my conversations with Matt, we would have both tired of the exercise long ago. Real, nourishing conversation involves significant and important disagreement. It depends upon a much richer common ground than mere civil discourse. Before I outline my understanding of this common ground, I'd like to articulate one more reason why mere civil discourse is not only insufficient, but occasionally even at cross purposes with real conversation. The call for civil discourse at Wabash and elsewhere usually occurs in the midst of vigorous, perhaps even fundamental disagreement. The call for civil discourse usually implies that the one calling for it believes that current discourse is not civil. In my experience, the call for civil discourse is usually accompanied by the affirmation of a noble principle. Civil discourse is neutral. It doesn't matter on which of the many sides of a disagreement you happen to fall, everyone must abide by the rules of civil discourse. It doesn't matter what you say, as long as you say it with civility. This noble principle of objectivity and neutrality is good and right. It is also right that those who stand atop this principle stand atop a moral high ground, above the fray of competing opinions. However, if the one calling for civil discourse is a participant in the disagreement, then such a one faces the temptation to exploit this moral high ground for the advantage of their own particular opinion. Some people use their supposed neutrality cynically or foolishly to try to win an argument. You've all heard people say something like, "My argument must be right because you are biased," or "You are obviously wrong because my position is logical." These sorts of informal fallacies are easily avoided. The potentially dangerous call for civil discourse comes when people don't realize that the moral high ground of neutrality lends their own opinions an appearance of superiority, independent of what the opinions happen to be or the reasons given for them are. Here's the problem in a nutshell. The call for more civil discourse clearly implies that the current discourse is uncivil. Of course, usually, none of the participants believe their own discourse to be uncivil. Thus, just who is being uncivil is something about which the participants disagree. Yet, the moment any participant accuses another of incivility, then the accusing participant has captured the moral high ground. And this high ground is particularly advantageous to one's own position. Accusing you of incivility necessarily puts me in the role of neutral arbiter. I am not engaging what you say, merely how you say it. Not only have I gained a competitive advantage in our disagreement by capturing the moral high ground, but, and this is worse, I have gained this advantage without addressing your opinions or the arguments for them. I'll leave you to imagine how such a situation could escalate, the result being that the call for more civil discourse results in less civil discourse. So while civil discourse is a fairly reliable way to avoid violence, I believe the very concept can work against real conversations and meaningful disagreements. If my conversations with my friend Matt were mere civil discourse, if we engaged in them primarily as a means of avoiding violence, then we would both have stopped arguing long ago. Unlike mere civil discourse, our verbal combat and vigorous conversation takes place upon the solid ground of deep and substantive agreement. The agreement that grounds our conversations and intellectual battles is a mysterious combination of friendship and humility. The common ground on which Matt and I compete, to which we inevitably fall in turn, and from which we extend the hand of friendship and leverage to begin again. This common ground is not mere civil discourse. Our common ground for argument is trust, charity, and the desire to learn from one another. We trust one another to avoid harm. Any pain must be willingly suffered. We trust that neither of us wants to inflict more than was bargained for, nor more than is necessary. We are charitable. We abide by a principle of charity that demands that each work to make the best sense of the other's positions and evidence. We want to understand each other. If I say something crazy, it's Matt's responsibility to try and figure out what I mean in such a way that he doesn't assume me a fool. This is much harder to do than to say, but it is one of the rules of edifying verbal combat. Finally, and most importantly, we both want to learn. Learning means coming to know or coming nearer to knowing what you do not currently know. Real learning requires the courage to admit that we do not already know the truth and the humility to admit that we may be wrong. The whole point of the conversation is for each of us to get beyond what we currently think. Perhaps obviously, I love real conversation, edifying verbal combat, and I highly recommend it to all of you. I love it because it presents the perfect opportunity to learn. While I find mere civil discourse insufficient to the goal of learning, I admit that civility may be necessary for that same goal, provided that what counts as civility isn't disputed by any of the participants. As long as no one uses civil discourse as an argumentative trick, one that at once claims the moral high ground and permits the user to disregard the substance of the opposition, then I suppose civil discourse could be a decent first step toward real conversation. However, some people have a different sense of what a conversation is than I do. Those with this different understanding of the purpose of conversation should reject my claim that civil discourse is merely necessary for genuine conversation. Let me briefly articulate this plausible and I believe common understanding of conversation. Some people think of conversation as primarily for the purpose of sharing opinions to reach mutual understanding. On this account, Matt and I argue in order to understand what the other thinks. Again, I think this is a plausible and common view of the purpose of conversation. And for such a view, civil discourse may indeed be sufficient to achieving it. I have a different sense of the purpose of conversation. For me, a conversation, especially a verbal combat, is for the sake of changing my own opinion. That is, for the sake of learning. For those who think conversation is for the sake of attaining mutual understanding, it is unjustifiable and illegitimate that Matt or I try to persuade one another of the truth of our own opinion. The reason is that the purpose of the conversation is simply to share, to understand, and even appreciate the diversity of one another's views. I agree that this is a necessary first step in a good conversation. Indeed, this is the goal of the principle of charity. Yet Matt and I don't stop with mutual understanding. Mutual understanding is for the sake of learning. Learning requires changing one's opinions, if only by addition. Learning doesn't require, indeed, learning is incompatible with changing other people's opinions. This is the crucial difference that distinguishes verbal combat of the edifying and the tedious sort. If your goal is to change someone else's opinion, then you can't learn because you've already decided you don't need to learn. We've already seen how the mere desire to win or the desire to play the game can defeat conversation. I agree with those who think of conversation as aiming toward mutual understanding on this point. Intellectual sparring is tedious at best and degrading at worst. My account of conversation doesn't aim at winning or merely sparring, nor does my account aim at mutual understanding. The purpose of verbal combat is to learn. That is, to come to a new opinion with the help of one's fellow combatant. The combat is always for the sake of something beyond either combatant's opinions or reasons. The goal and standard of our conversation is truth. Our common ground from which we seek the truth demands of us trust, charity, and a desire to learn. Thus, we must work to understand one another in such a way that we always assume the best of the other. Yet mutual understanding is not enough to explain the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, and the competition for truth that animates my conversations with my friend Matt. Honestly, what I love about Matt is not that he has opinions different from my own, but that he may be right. I trust he would say the same about me. Matt and I believe that we speak with civility. Whether others agree, I have no idea. We achieve mutual understanding of diverse opinions. We certainly engage one another with a spirit of competition that is not reducible to the desire to win. Matt and I argue. These arguments are built upon and sustained by trust, charity, and the desire to learn. I think the expression verbal combat best captures what we love about our agonistic conversations, that which goes beyond mere civil discourse and intellectual sparring. Matt and I compete for what neither of us have, for what we believe we can achieve by a very special kind of combat. Matt and I compete for the truth. We haven't found it yet, but if you will join us in the battle, with courage enough to fail and humility enough to win, together, we may just learn something.